Jeff Bezos goes undercover as homeless in a restaurant. What happened next will blow your mind. Jeff Bezos sat at a small corner table, hunched over a cup of cheap coffee in a worn-out diner in downtown Seattle. His appearance was far from the polished tech mogul most people knew him to be. He had discarded his usual sleek suits and traded them for a scruffy jacket and faded jeans, his face hidden under a baseball cap. He barely looked up as a waitress walked past, carrying a tray of pancakes and syrup to a nearby table. If she recognized him, she gave no indication. He had come here for a reason that no one, not even the staff in the restaurant, could have imagined. Jeff Bezos, the man who built Amazon, the richest person on the planet, was undercover. He had decided to spend a day in the shoes of someone who had very little, someone who lived on the streets. His mission was simple: to see what life was like for the homeless, to understand their struggles in a way no billionaire ever had. But what he didn't expect was the events that would follow, events that would shake him to his core and change everything he thought he knew about the world. As he sat there, pretending to be just another homeless person, a man in his 40s walked in, looking like he hadn't showered in days. His clothes were torn, and his face was weathered by years of hardship. He scanned the diner and, without hesitation, sat down at the table across from Jeff. The man looked at him for a moment, as though deciding whether to speak, before finally offering a soft, "You doing all right, buddy?" Jeff was taken back. He hadn't expected someone to talk to him, much less a stranger. He nodded, offering a half-smile. "Yeah, just trying to keep warm," Jeff said, his voice gruff, matching the tone of the man's. The man smiled faintly. "They got the best coffee here. You should try the eggs too, real filling if you're hungry." "I'm good for now," Jeff replied, trying to keep things casual, but his heart was racing. This was the first time in his life he had been on the receiving end of such kindness. And that's when it happened. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled dollar bill. "You sure you don't need anything?" "I could buy you breakfast if you're hungry," the man said, pressing the bill into Jeff's hand. For a moment, Jeff didn't know how to react. Here was a person who had nothing, and he was offering to share it with someone he didn't even know. It struck him hard. It was a kindness that no billionaire had ever offered him in his life. He couldn't remember the last time someone had simply offered help without expecting anything in return. Just as Jeff was about to respond, the door to the diner opened with a loud clang. A group of men walked in, their voices loud, their laughter ringing through the small space. Jeff looked up just as they approached the counter. One of the men, wearing a leather jacket and dark sunglasses, spotted him sitting there and immediately made his way over. Jeff's heart skipped a beat. There was something about this man, the way he walked, the way he carried himself, that made Jeff nervous. But before he could react, the man spoke. "You must be lost, buddy," the man said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You don't belong here." The group laughed, their amusement growing as they surrounded Jeff's table. "Hey, give him a break," the homeless man across from Jeff suddenly said, standing up. "He's just a guy trying to stay warm. Doesn't deserve your nonsense." The leader of the group smirked. "And what's your story, huh?" he asked, looking the homeless man up and down. Before the situation could escalate further, the waitress stepped in, her voice firm. "You all need to settle down or you're out. This is a place for everyone, and if you can't show some respect, then don't bother coming back." Jeff's mind raced. What was going to happen next? Was this how the day was going to unfold? Would things get worse? The tension in the room was thick as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Jeff felt his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure what to do. But before he could process everything, the man in the leather jacket suddenly turned and walked out, signaling the rest of his group to follow. The homeless man sat back down, a look of relief crossing his face. Jeff didn't know whether to thank him or stay quiet. He had never been in a situation like this before. But one thing was clear: this day was going to change everything. What happened next would blow Jeff's mind. The air in the diner grew tense after the group left. It wasn't just the lingering noise of their footsteps that made it awkward. There was an unsettling feeling now, as though everyone in the room was silently holding their breath, waiting for something, anything. Jeff glanced at the man who had come to his defense. He was back in his seat, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly, his eyes focused on the window, as though pretending nothing unusual had happened. "Thanks," Jeff said quietly. He wasn't sure what else to say. The man looked up at him, blinking slowly. "No problem. People around here can be real jerks sometimes." He took a long sip from his own cup, his hands shaking just slightly. Jeff felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. He had been part of a world where people would never have to worry about being bullied for sitting in a diner. But now, here with this man who had next to nothing, yet still stood up for him. Jeff felt something different, something he hadn't known he was missing. "You're not from around here, are you?" the man asked, his voice soft but direct. He studied Jeff with a piercing gaze, like he could see through the disguise. "No," Jeff replied, not really sure why he was being so honest, but he couldn't seem to lie. "I'm just passing through." The man raised an eyebrow. "Passing through, huh? Well, you picked the wrong spot for that. This place doesn't get a lot of tourists, if that's what you mean. But if you're looking for a place to stay, I can tell you where the shelters are." Jeff looked down at his hands. He felt embarrassed now. He wasn't here for the shelters. He wasn't even sure what he was doing here anymore. His initial goal had been simple: to understand, to experience, to walk in the shoes of those who lived without the luxuries he took for granted. But now, after the encounter with the group of men, after the kindness this stranger had shown him, Jeff felt as though he was part of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. "I'm okay," Jeff said, forcing a smile. "I'm just figuring things out." The man gave a short nod, like he understood more than Jeff had said. "Figuring things out," he repeated quietly, almost to himself. "Well, good luck with that." Just then, the waitress returned, setting a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of the man. "You're looking at the best breakfast in town," she said with a wink. "Don't say I didn't warn you." The man gave her a small, almost grateful smile. He picked up his fork and began eating without saying another word. Jeff didn't know how long he sat there, quietly watching the man eat, feeling the strange weight of the morning's events settle deeper into his mind. The waitress brought him a refill on his coffee, and he sipped it absently, lost in thought. What had made him do this? Why had he felt the need to experience the world in this way? Was it simply a desire to walk in the shoes of those less fortunate, or was there something deeper, something more personal, that was driving him? Jeff hadn't been able to answer that question, and right now, he wasn't sure he wanted to. He looked at the homeless man again, his face a mixture of hard lines and weariness. There was a story behind those eyes, a story of hardship, of survival, of loss. Jeff could feel it, that undeniable pull, the realization that he had been living in a bubble, untouched by the reality most people faced every day. But that thought didn't have time to settle before something unexpected happened. The door to the diner opened once again, and this time it wasn't a group of troublemakers. It was a woman, a young woman in her 20s, dressed in a brightly colored coat. She stepped inside quickly, scanning the diner with a look of distress on her face. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaking as she approached the counter. "Has anyone seen a man, an older man, about 60, with gray hair and a red jacket?" The waitress behind the counter looked at her and nodded. "You mean Mr. Thompson? He comes in here every day. What's going on? Is he all right?" The woman looked like she might break down any second. "I don't know. I've been looking for him everywhere. He's been missing for 3 days. He always comes here to eat, and he's never late." Jeff's heart raced. He didn't know why, but he felt a deep sense of concern for the woman. She looked genuinely worried, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm sure he's around here somewhere," the waitress said, trying to reassure her. But Jeff could tell there was an underlying tension in her voice. "Maybe he just got caught up somewhere. It's a big city." The woman shook her head. "No, something's wrong. He's not the type to disappear. I know something's happened to him." Before Jeff could ask any more questions, the homeless man who had been sitting across from him stood up and moved toward the counter. "I'll help you find him," he said to the woman. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable determination in his eyes. "I know these streets. I can ask around." The woman looked at him, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. "You'll really help me. You don't even know him." "I may not know him," the man replied, "but I know what it's like to be alone, to feel like no one cares. I'm not just going to sit here and do nothing." Jeff watched as the homeless man, a stranger to this woman, placed his hand on her shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. The woman seemed taken aback for a moment, but then she nodded, as if grateful for the support. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. The man turned to Jeff, meeting his gaze for a brief moment. "You coming?" he asked. Jeff was taken by surprise. "What? Are you going to just sit there and watch, or are you going to help too?" For a second, Jeff didn't know how to respond. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this. He had come here to observe, to learn, not to get involved in someone else's crisis. But something inside him, some part of him that had been stirred by the kindness of the man and the urgency of the woman's distress, pushed him to act. "I'll help," Jeff said, standing up and grabbing his jacket. As he followed the homeless man and the woman out of the diner, Jeff couldn't shake the feeling that something big was unfolding. He wasn't just witnessing the struggles of those living on the streets anymore. He was becoming a part of their story, and he had no idea how far this journey would take him. But one thing was certain: what happened next would change everything. The cold Seattle air hit Jeff like a slap in the face as he stepped out of the diner. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, trying to shield himself from the biting wind. The woman, whose name was Sarah, led the way, her steps quick and anxious. The homeless man, who Jeff still didn't know the name of, walked alongside her, his hands stuffed into his pockets, eyes scanning the streets with an almost predatory focus. Jeff was caught in an unfamiliar mix of confusion and urgency. He had come to observe, to understand what it was like to live without money, without the safety net of his wealth. But now, it felt like he had stepped into a situation where things were spiraling beyond what he had imagined. He was no longer just a bystander. He was part of something real, something that mattered. Sarah led them through a maze of alleyways, down streets that Jeff had never walked down before. The city, with its towering buildings and endless bustle, now seemed like a foreign landscape to him. He had spent years in the high-rise offices of Amazon, surrounded by other tech giants, working late into the night and counting profits, and yet here he was, in the thick of the city's underbelly, where survival was a constant battle. The stark contrast between his old life and the world he was walking through now was almost suffocating. "This way," Sarah said, pointing down a narrow street that led to a row of abandoned buildings. Her voice trembled slightly, but there was no mistaking the determination in it. The homeless man gave a low whistle, taking in the side of the alley. "He's been here before," he muttered under his breath. Sarah turned to look at him, eyes wide. "You've seen him." The man nodded. "I know these streets. If anyone's out here, I can find them." Jeff's thoughts were racing. He didn't know who this Mr. Thompson was, but something about the urgency in Sarah's voice, the way she practically dragged them through the city, told him that this wasn't just about a missing person. There was something more, something deeper. They stopped at the corner of the street. The homeless man turned to Jeff. "You sure you want to help? You don't have to, you know." Jeff glanced at him, momentarily thrown off by the question. For a second, he wondered if he should just walk away. But then, he thought about the kindness the man had shown him earlier in the diner. If he backed out now, it would feel wrong. "I'm in," Jeff said firmly, his voice almost unrecognizable to him. "Let's do this." The man nodded and led the way into the alley. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the narrow space, mingling with the distant noise of the city. Jeff could feel his pulse quickening. This was no longer a simple observation. He was fully involved now, part of this search. They came to a stop in front of a dilapidated building. The windows were boarded up, and the entrance was barely visible through a thick layer of grime and graffiti. Sarah hesitated for a moment, glancing nervously at the building, before she pushed the door open. The homeless man stepped inside first, followed by Sarah. Jeff was last, still unsure of what he was walking into. Inside, the building smelled of dampness and decay. There was an eerie quietness to the place, as if it hadn't been touched in years. The floors creaked under their weight as they made their way through the dark, musty hallway. Sarah's eyes darted around as if searching for something, her breaths shallow. The homeless man, however, seemed perfectly at ease. He moved forward with the confidence of someone who knew these kinds of places all too well. "Mr. Thompson," he called out, his voice echoing in the silence. "You here?" There was no answer. The only sound was the faint rustle of rats scurrying in the walls and the distant hum of traffic outside. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah repeated, louder this time, her voice cracking with desperation. Jeff felt an uncomfortable tightness in his chest. This wasn't just a missing person search. This was personal. Sarah's distress, the urgency in her every step, it all pointed to something deeper. She wasn't just worried about Mr. Thompson being gone. She was worried about something worse. "Let's check upstairs," the homeless man said, his tone low but steady. He motioned toward a stairwell at the far end of the hall. They ascended slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. As they reached the top, the air grew colder, and the silence became more oppressive. The light from the windows above barely filtered through the grime on the glass, casting long shadows along the walls. At the top of the stairs, the man stopped and turned to Jeff and Sarah. His face was unreadable, but Jeff could see the flicker of caution in his eyes. He had seen something before that made him wary. "Stay here," the man said quietly, his voice a whisper now. "Let me check the room first." Before Jeff could protest, the homeless man moved down the hallway and disappeared around the corner. Sarah remained motionless, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes fixed on the spot where the man had disappeared. Jeff's mind raced. What was going on here? Who was Mr. Thompson? Why had he been missing for 3 days? And why was the homeless man so quiet now, so cautious? What was he expecting to find? The tension in the air was palpable. Every second felt like it stretched on forever. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the man's voice came from down the hallway. "Come here," he called softly. "You need to see this." Jeff and Sarah exchanged a look before hurrying toward the sound of his voice. When they turned the corner, the sight that greeted them stopped them in their tracks. There, in a small, dimly lit room, was Mr. Thompson. But he wasn't just sitting there waiting, as they had expected. No, he was slumped over in a chair, his body limp and lifeless. The room was eerily still, and for a moment, neither Sarah nor Jeff moved. The homeless man stepped forward, his face darkening. "I knew something was wrong," he muttered under his breath. "He's been gone for too long. I should have come sooner." Sarah rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside Mr. Thompson's chair. She shook him gently, her voice breaking. "No, no, please, wake up. Mr. Thompson, please." But there was no response. Jeff stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The shock of it hit him like a freight train. This wasn't what he had expected. Not by a long shot. What had happened to Mr. Thompson? Was he really gone, or was there something else at play here? The homeless man moved to the window and glanced outside. His expression hardened. "We need to get out of here," he said urgently. "Now." But just as they were about to leave, something caught Jeff's eye. There, tucked beneath Mr. Thompson's hand, was a small, folded piece of paper. Before Jeff could reach for it, a loud crash echoed through the building, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone else was here. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, and Jeff knew, deep in his gut, that they weren't alone anymore. Who else was in this building, and what did they want with Mr. Thompson? The next few moments would answer everything. The room was suddenly suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on Jeff, his heart pounding in his chest as he stared at the doorway, where the sound of heavy footsteps had just stopped. His eyes flickered back to the crumpled piece of paper in Mr. Thompson's hand, and for a split second, he considered grabbing it. But then the realization hit him. They weren't alone anymore. Someone else had entered the building, and they were getting closer. "Who's there?" Sarah's voice trembled as she stood up from Mr. Thompson's side, her eyes darting toward the door. The footsteps stopped again. For a brief moment, there was silence. The tension was unbearable. Then a voice, deep, rough, and far too calm for comfort, cut through the stillness. "I think you've come to the wrong place, sweetheart." Jeff felt a chill run down his spine. The voice was unfamiliar, but it was laced with an unmistakable threat. He turned to the homeless man beside him, who was now standing at the window, eyes narrowed, his body tense. "Stay calm," the man whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Don't make any sudden moves." Sarah's breathing quickened, and she shot Jeff a nervous glance. "Who are they? Do you think they—" But before she could finish her sentence, the door creaked open, and a tall man in a dark hoodie stepped into the room, blocking the doorway. His face was partially obscured by the hood, but his presence was unmistakable. He was someone who didn't need to say much to make it clear he was in control. He was dangerous. 2 more men followed him in, their eyes scanning the room with the cold precision of people used to getting what they wanted. The leader's eyes fixed on Sarah first, sizing her up with a look that made her flinch. "Whoa," he said slowly, his lips curling into a sneer. "What do we have here?" Jeff instinctively stepped forward, his body tense, unsure of what to do next. He had spent his life negotiating with powerful people, finding ways to win over the toughest of opponents. But this was different. These weren't the type of people he could buy off with money or charm. "Don't make a scene," the man in the hoodie said, his voice cold as ice. He stepped forward, his eyes flicking between Jeff, Sarah, and the homeless man. "This doesn't have to be complicated." Jeff's mind raced. They were trapped. There was no way out of the building without going through them. And with Mr. Thompson still slumped over in the chair, there was no telling what these men had done or what they intended to do next. The homeless man, to Jeff's surprise, stepped in front of Sarah, blocking her from view. He wasn't backing down, even though he was outnumbered. "You don't want to do this," the homeless man said, his voice steady, despite the obvious tension in the room. "Just leave her out of it." The leader of the group smirked, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Leave her out of it." He turned his gaze to Sarah, then back to the man, as though weighing his options. "I don't think I'll be doing that. We've had business to take care of, and it's not with you." Jeff's stomach twisted. He could feel the situation spiraling out of control, and it made him uneasy. These men weren't here to have a conversation. They had come for something, and that something was tied to Mr. Thompson, the missing man whose life now seemed to hang in the balance. Then the homeless man did something that shocked Jeff even more. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn, but clearly well-used knife. The blade caught the dim light from the broken windows, glinting menacingly. The homeless man didn't raise it, but he didn't back down either. "I don't want trouble," he said, his voice low but firm. "But if you want it, I'll give it." For a moment, there was silence. The leader of the group didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a small mocking laugh. "You think that little knife is going to stop us?" he scoffed. "You got guts, I'll give you that. But you're outmatched." He motioned for the two men behind him to move forward. "Take care of him," the leader said casually, like giving an order to take out the trash. Before Jeff could react, the two men lunged at the homeless man. One grabbed his arm while the other went for his throat, trying to wrestle him to the ground. The homeless man struggled fiercely, but the odds were against him. In the chaos, Jeff felt a surge of panic. His heart was pounding in his ears. He had never been in a situation like this before, never had to make a split-second decision in the face of real danger. But something inside him snapped. He couldn't just stand by and watch this happen. Without thinking, Jeff lunged forward, pushing past the two men who were attacking the homeless man. He grabbed the one holding the man's arm and yanked him away. The man stumbled backward in surprise, but Jeff didn't stop. He was already moving again, this time toward the other assailant. "Let him go," Jeff shouted, his voice louder than he had intended. His hands trembled, but adrenaline pushed him forward. The second man, momentarily distracted, turned toward Jeff, eyes narrowing. The man swung at Jeff with a punch, but Jeff ducked, feeling the air whoosh as the fist narrowly missed his face. Before the man could recover, Jeff shoved him hard, sending him stumbling into the wall. The homeless man, still clutching his knife, managed to break free. He shoved the attacker away and got to his feet, breathing heavily. "You all right?" he asked Jeff, his voice strained. Jeff didn't answer. His mind was spinning, but the fear was still there, gnawing at him. He turned to Sarah, who had backed away, her eyes wide with fear. "Get Mr. Thompson," he ordered, his voice sharp. "We need to get out of here now." But as soon as he spoke, the leader of the group took a step forward, his expression darkening. "You shouldn't have done that," he said calmly. Now he made things personal. The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a small pistol, pointing it straight at Jeff. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Jeff's heart stopped. But then, something unexpected happened. Just as the man was about to pull the trigger, the door slammed open and a loud voice rang out. "Police! Don't move!" The three men froze, their faces flickering between confusion and panic. Behind them stood a group of uniformed officers, guns drawn, their eyes scanning the room, ready for anything. "You're under arrest," the lead officer said, his voice steady but authoritative. "Drop the weapons." For a moment, the room was chaos. The men who had been threatening Jeff, Sarah, and the homeless man didn't have time to react. The officers moved in quickly, handcuffing them and securing the weapons with practiced efficiency. Jeff's mind was still spinning as he watched the scene unfold. How had the police found them? Who had tipped them off? And what did this mean for the rest of the mystery surrounding Mr. Thompson? As the officers began to take the men away, the homeless man turned to Jeff and Sarah, his face hardening. "This isn't over," he said. "Not by a long shot." Before Jeff could respond, the homeless man turned and disappeared into the shadows of the building, leaving them behind, still caught in the web of a story that was far from finished. What had they just stumbled into? And what was really going on with Mr. Thompson? The answers were out there, but Jeff had no idea just how deep the rabbit hole went. The flashing red and blue lights from the squad cars painted the alley in a harsh, surreal glow as the police led the three men away, their hands cuffed tightly behind their backs. The leader of the group, the one who had threatened Jeff, walked with his head hung low, his eyes darting around nervously, as if trying to figure out how things had gone so wrong so quickly. The other two men followed closely behind, their faces dark with frustration and anger. Jeff stood frozen for a moment, his heart still racing, his mind struggling to make sense of everything that had just happened. The police had shown up just in time. What, how? Who had called them? Was it the homeless man? Had he known the police were coming? "Are you all right?" Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. She stood beside him now, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock, but she was trying to hold it together. I think so," Jeff replied, his voice shaky. He still couldn't believe what had just happened. But who called the police? How did they know where we were? Sarah shook her head, her gaze fixed on the departing criminals. I had no idea. Maybe it was the homeless man. He seemed like he knew more than he was letting on. Just then, the officer in charge, a tall woman with short cropped hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, approached them. I'm Officer Daniels, she said, her voice firm but reassuring. You're both safe now, but I need to ask a few questions. Jeff nodded, still trying to process everything. What's going on here? Who were those men, and how did you find us? Officer Daniels glanced over her shoulder at the group of arrested men, her expression hardening. Those men are part of a local gang. They've been involved in a number of criminal activities around here, including drug trafficking and human trafficking. We've been trying to track them down for a while. Jeff's stomach churned. He had no idea the city had such a dark underbelly. He had always thought of Seattle as a clean, progressive place, where tech startups thrived and innovation was the name of the game. But now, standing here in an alley, surrounded by the remnants of violence and danger, he was beginning to realize how little he truly understood. Human trafficking? Sarah repeated, her voice trembling. You're telling me Mr. Thompson was involved in that? Officer Daniels' eyes softened, but only for a moment. It's possible. We don't have all the details yet, but it looks like Thompson was either a victim or a witness to some of their operations. He may have been trying to expose them, but for now, it's too soon to know for sure. Jeff's mind reeled. Mr. Thompson, the elderly man Sarah had been searching for, had been caught up in something this dangerous. The same man who had disappeared for days, only to turn up lifeless in that building? The thought sent a wave of nausea through him. Then, what happens now? Jeff asked, his voice strained. Is he dead? Officer Daniels didn't answer immediately, her gaze turning briefly to the building behind them. I can't say for certain, but it's unlikely he'll make it. From the looks of him, he may have been here for days, and we're not sure how much longer he could have lasted. If he was mixed up in this, he might have been targeted by the gang. Sarah's face crumpled, her lips trembling. She had been holding it together so far, but hearing that news, hearing that Mr. Thompson might have been used as some kind of pawn in a larger criminal operation, was too much for her to bear. She wiped her eyes quickly, trying to regain composure. Do you have any idea what he was trying to do? Jeff asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why was he involved with those men? Officer Daniels sighed, rubbing her temple as though trying to ease the weight of the situation. We're still piecing things together, but we think Thompson might have been trying to gather evidence against them. He was always a bit of a loner, always hanging around places like this. He knew too much, and we think they found out. That's why he went into hiding, but we still don't know everything yet. The words hit Jeff harder than he expected. Mr. Thompson hadn't just been an innocent bystander. He had been an active participant in trying to take down these criminals. But what kind of man was he, to risk his life like that? And what had pushed him to do it? Just as Jeff was about to ask another question, a voice interrupted them. Is he gone? It was the homeless man, stepping out from the shadows of the building, his face grim. He had been watching the scene unfold from a distance, and now he approached them slowly, as though hesitant to get too close. Who? Sarah asked, her voice raw. She glanced at Jeff, her eyes pleading for answers. Mr. Thompson, the homeless man said, looking down at the ground. Is he gone? Officer Daniels shook her head. We don't know yet. The homeless man didn't seem surprised by the answer. He stood there for a moment, silent, as if processing the information. Then he looked at Sarah. You were looking for him? He asked. Sarah nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. He was my uncle, she said softly. He's been missing for days. I didn't know. I didn't know he was mixed up in this kind of thing. The homeless man studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing faintly in the alley. Sarah made to follow him, but Jeff stopped her. Let him go, he said gently. He's been through enough. We all have. But Sarah wasn't ready to give up. She looked at Jeff, her face pleading. I need to understand. Why would he get involved in something like this? And why didn't he tell me? Jeff felt a weight in his chest. He had no answers. In fact, he had more questions than he could process. We'll figure it out, he said, though his words fell hollow. But for now, let's get out of here. It's not safe. The police had finished their work, and the gang members were being escorted to the squad cars, but the scene felt far from over. Something was still wrong. Something didn't add up. Just before they could leave, Officer Daniels stopped them. I'm sorry to interrupt, "But there's something you need to know," she said, her tone serious. "We found something in Mr. Thompson's possession. It's a list of names, and there's one name on that list that might interest you." Jeff felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Who?" "The name is Bezos," Officer Daniels said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Jeff. "Do you know who that is?" Jeff froze, the world around him spinning. He felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. Bezos, his own name. Why was his name on that list? And why was Mr. Thompson involved with something so dangerous? Questions. Too many questions. But this was just the beginning. And whatever had happened to Mr. Thompson, Jeff now realized, had just led him into something much larger than he had ever imagined. The world around Jeff seemed to blur for a moment. Officer Daniels' words echoed in his head like a dull drumbeat, growing louder and more frantic with each passing second. Bezos, his name. His own name was on that list. He could feel the cold sweat gathering at the back of his neck, his pulse hammering in his ears. It was as if the ground beneath him had shifted, and he was no longer standing in the alley, talking to Sarah, the officer. He was somewhere else, somewhere dark and unknown. The list, the man's death, the gang, it all pointed back to him. But how? Why? "Jeff, are you okay?" Sarah's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. He blinked and looked at her. Her eyes were full of concern, but she was also waiting for an answer, expecting him to say something, anything. "Yeah, I'm fine," he muttered, though it felt like a lie. He could feel his hands shaking. This didn't make sense. Why was my name on that list? Officer Daniels watched him closely, her sharp eyes catching the subtle change in Jeff's demeanor. She must have noticed something was off. "You're sure you don't know anything about this?" she asked, her voice steady but probing. Jeff stammered, his throat dry. He could feel the pressure of her gaze on him, digging deeper. The list had to be a mistake, right? He had no connection to this underworld of gangs and criminals. He was Jeff Bezos, the billionaire CEO of Amazon, a man who built one of the largest companies in the world from the ground up. But then why? Why his name? "I don't know anything about this," Jeff said, his voice hoarse now. "I swear." Officer Daniels didn't seem convinced, but she didn't press further. She looked over at Sarah. "We're going to need to bring you both in for questioning, just routine. It'll help us figure out what happened to your uncle." Jeff nodded absently. His mind was already far away, turning over the possibilities. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking into a dark abyss. What had Mr. Thompson uncovered? And why had he been trying to expose something that involved him? "I don't understand," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Why was he mixed up in this? What was he trying to do?" "I don't know," Jeff repeated. He ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts spinning. "But I need to find out." The police had already secured the area, but there was still a lingering sense of danger in the air. Sarah and Jeff were led to the nearby squad car, their minds heavy with questions. The officers remained silent as they drove, the tension in the car thick and suffocating. Jeff barely registered the city's streets as they'd passed by in a blur. He was lost in his own thoughts. Once they arrived at the police station, the reality of the situation hit him again. The sterile white walls and harsh fluorescent lights of the interrogation room were a far cry from the comfortable, controlled world he was used to. This wasn't a boardroom. This wasn't a place where decisions could be made with a click of a button or a strategic phone call. This was real life, and real lives were at stake. "Just stay calm," Sarah said quietly as they sat across from each other at the table. She was still shaken, but her resolve was beginning to return. She wiped her eyes, took a deep breath, and looked Jeff in the eye. "We'll figure this out. We have to." Jeff nodded absently, though he didn't feel any calmer. His mind was too clouded with the mystery of Mr. Thompson's connection to the gang, and now the involvement of his own name. "Why me?" After a few long moments, Officer Daniels entered the room. Her face was serious, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something Jeff couldn't quite place. She set a file on the table and sat across from them. "I've got some information," she said, "but we need to talk." Jeff leaned forward, his instincts kicking in. "What do you know?" Officer Daniels opened the file, pulling out a few sheets of paper. "We ran the name on the list you're connected to. Bezos is a big name in our systems, obviously. But it's not just your name. There's something else tied to it." Jeff frowned. "What do you mean?" She slid a piece of paper across the table to him. It was a document full of names and addresses, but one name stood out, Jeff Bezos. Beneath it was an address that didn't look familiar, along with another, more cryptic note, "Confirmed link to Citywide Network." "Citywide Network?" Jeff repeated, his voice tight. "What does that mean?" Officer Daniels hesitated, then said slowly, "It means your name has been connected to more than just business dealings in Seattle. There's a link to some shady real estate deals, properties bought under a shell company, and from what we can tell, this company is linked to a network of corrupt businessmen and criminals." Jeff's stomach dropped. This was more than he had bargained for. Corrupt businessmen, real estate deals. This was a different world altogether, one that Jeff had never ventured into, at least not knowingly. "Are you suggesting that I'm somehow involved in this?" Jeff asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The thought of being implicated in a criminal network made his skin crawl. Officer Daniels looked at him, her eyes hard. "I'm not saying anything yet, but these connections, they go deep. We're talking about millions of dollars, money laundering, and people like Mr. Thompson, who seem to have gotten in over their heads." Jeff shook his head, trying to process everything. His business had been built on trust, innovation, and doing things the right way. But this was nothing like he'd ever imagined. Could his name, his real name, really be involved in something this dark? "The police have been investigating this for a while, but we've only scratched the surface," Officer Daniels continued. "If you've been targeted by this network, you need to be careful. We don't know who's behind it, but they're dangerous." Jeff felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had never felt more out of control in his life, and now, with everything he thought he knew turned upside down, the fear that had been gnawing at him finally broke through. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice strained. "How do we stop this?" Officer Daniels hesitated, clearly weighing her words. "We need your help. We need you to cooperate. If you're not involved, we can prove that. But we need to follow the trail wherever it leads." Sarah looked between the two of them. "What kind of help do you need from us?" "We'll need your access to any real estate records, any business connections, anything related to this shell company. If you're truly innocent, Jeff, this is the only way we'll get to the bottom of this," Officer Daniels said, her tone urgent but not unkind. Jeff swallowed hard. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. This wasn't just about his business anymore. This was about something much bigger. But he wasn't going to sit back and let his name be dragged through the mud, not without answers. "I'll help," he said finally, his voice steady. "I'll do whatever it takes." "Good," Officer Daniels replied. "But be warned, Jeff, whoever's behind this won't stop until they get what they want. And if that means pulling you into their world, they'll do it. You need to be prepared for that." Jeff's heart skipped a beat. The stakes had just gotten much higher. As Officer Daniels left the room, Jeff and Sarah were left alone, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. "We'll get through this," Sarah said softly, but Jeff could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "Yeah," Jeff replied, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. "We will." But as he thought about the name on the list, the connections and the mystery surrounding Mr. Thompson's death, Jeff couldn't shake the feeling that they were just getting started, and that the danger was only beginning to close in. And somewhere in the shadows, the real mastermind behind all of this was watching. Would they make it out alive? The hours dragged by, each one feeling heavier than the last. After Officer Daniels let them alone in the sterile interrogation room, Jeff sat in silence, staring at the table in front of him. His mind kept looping back to one thing, the name on the list. Bezos, his name. And now the thought that his business, his entire life, might be linked to a criminal underworld he had no idea existed. It was overwhelming. Sarah, sitting across from him, looked equally exhausted. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying, but there was a spark of determination there that Jeff hadn't seen before. Maybe she was just trying to hold it together for both of them. He could barely keep himself together. Every part of him wanted to scream, to demand answers, to figure out what had gone so horribly wrong. But for now, all they could do was wait. After what seemed like an eternity, Officer Daniels returned, but this time she wasn't alone. A man in a suit walked in behind her, his face unreadable, his eyes scanning the room as though taking stock of the situation. He was tall, in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair and a stern expression. His clothes looked expensive, but the way he carried himself suggested he wasn't used to working in an office. He was here for something far more serious. "This is Detective Adams," Officer Daniels introduced him. "He's going to be helping us with your case, Jeff." Detective Adams didn't offer a handshake. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to command attention. He took a seat, flipping open a folder in front of him, and without looking up, said, "I've seen your name before. Bezos. It's not just a name that pops up in business meetings or news articles. There's something bigger here." Jeff felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He could hear the words, but he couldn't believe them. Bezos. The name that had once stood for success, innovation, and progress now seemed to be tangled up in something ugly, something sinister. "I don't know how I'm connected to any of this," Jeff said, his voice strained. "I'm just a businessman. I've never been involved with gangs, human trafficking, or whatever this is about." Detective Adams looked up, his gaze sharp. "We know, and that's the problem. Someone is using your name, and we need to figure out why." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Jeff's mind raced. Someone is using my name. But who and how? He had built Amazon from the ground up, never once thinking that his business dealings could be used as a cover for something illegal. "How do you know my name was being used?" Jeff asked, leaning forward. "Who would do something like that?" Detective Adams glanced at Officer Daniels, who nodded subtly. He then slid a few documents across the table to Jeff. They were records, some related to Amazon, others to properties that Jeff didn't recognize. The documents listed transactions, addresses, and names, but none of them were familiar. "We've been tracking a series of real estate transactions," Adams began, his voice low but urgent. "They're all connected to a shell company, one that's been moving millions of dollars through untraceable accounts. These transactions are all tied to properties in neighborhoods where the gang you encountered earlier operates. But here's where it gets interesting." He paused, letting the silence stretch out for a moment before dropping the bombshell. "The owner of that shell company is listed as Jeff Bezos." Jeff's head snapped up. He felt as if the room had just tilted on its axis. "What?" Adams nodded slowly. "We traced the records. Someone created a company under your name, and they've been using it to buy properties, launder money, and move resources that have ties to organized crime. It's been going on for at least a year." "No," Jeff said, his voice barely audible. "That can't be possible." "It is," Daniels confirmed, her voice tense. "We're still trying to figure out how your name was connected to these deals. If you didn't do it, someone must have hacked into your personal information, or perhaps it's a deeper scheme that goes further back." Jeff sat back in his chair, his head spinning. "How could I not know about this? I have security, I have teams that handle everything. My personal information is locked down tight." "That's what we need to figure out," Detective Adams said. "Someone must have found a way in. They might have been using your identity without your knowledge." "But why?" Jeff asked, the question hanging heavily between them. "Why would they use my name?" Adams hesitated, tapping his fingers against the table. "That's the million-dollar question. Someone is pulling the strings here, and they're using your name to cover their tracks. The criminal network involved is far-reaching, and it's been operating under the radar for years. If your name is tied to it, it means they've either been targeting you specifically, or they know that your public profile could help shield their operations." Jeff's mind raced as he processed the information. This wasn't just about money or real estate. This was about power and control. Someone was using his name to protect their operations, to make their illegal activities seem legitimate. And somehow Mr. Thompson had gotten tangled up in it all. Had Mr. Thompson discovered this connection? Had he been trying to expose it? Or had he been one of their pawns all along? "I can't believe this is happening," Jeff murmured, his eyes closing for a moment. "I don't know what to do." Officer Daniels leaned forward, her voice softer now. "We'll help you. But you have to trust us. We need access to your files, your emails, anything that could help us figure out how they got to you. We can clear your name, but we need to see the full picture." Jeff looked at Sarah, who had been quiet until now. She hadn't spoken since Detective Adams came in, but Jeff could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She didn't want to be a part of this world. She just wanted to find out what happened to her uncle. But now, like him, she was in this deeper than they could have imagined. "Sarah, Jeff began, his voice breaking for the first time. "I don't know how we got here, but I need your help too. We need to figure this out together." She gave him a small, determined nod. "I'll help you. But we need answers, Jeff, for my uncle, for all of this." Jeff exhaled slowly, the weight of everything pressing down on him. There was no turning back now. Whatever had happened to Mr. Thompson, and whatever this criminal network wanted from him, he was in it. And if he didn't act fast, his life, his company, his reputation, could be ruined forever. As the hours stretched on, and as the detectives worked with his team to dig through his records, Jeff couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. Every new piece of information brought him closer to an answer, but the answers only seemed to raise more questions. And in the shadows, someone was watching, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The question was, what were they going to do next? And would Jeff be able to stop them before it was too late? The next few days felt like an endless blur. The world outside the small police station seemed to move on, as though nothing had changed. People went to work, kids went to school, cars drove down the streets without a care in the world. But for Jeff, everything had turned upside down. His life, his empire, his very identity were now tangled in a web of lies, crime, and deceit. And as the investigation deepened, he felt himself sinking deeper into a pit that he had no idea how to escape from. Detective Adams and Officer Daniels had kept in constant contact with Jeff and Sarah. Their work was relentless, poring over every email, every document, every shred of evidence they could find. They were building a timeline, one that stretched back years, linking seemingly innocent transactions to dark criminal activities. But the more they uncovered, the more Jeff realized how little he knew about the forces at play. Who was behind the shell company? Who had the power to manipulate his identity and use it for criminal activity? Every answer only led to more questions. The gang he had encountered in the alley, the one that had tied Mr. Thompson into their web, was just the tip of the iceberg. One evening, as Jeff sat in his study, staring blankly at his laptop screen, his phone rang. It was an unknown number, but Jeff answered anyway. He had learned not to trust anything, but he couldn't ignore the chance that this could be the breakthrough they needed. "Hello," he answered, his voice hoarse. There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a cold, familiar voice. "Jeff." His heart skipped a beat. He recognized the voice instantly. It was a man he'd never met in person but had heard of many times, a shadowy figure whose name had floated through the corridors of business circles in Seattle and far beyond. "Who is this?" Jeff asked, his pulse quickening. The voice on the phone sounded almost too calm, too composed for the situation at hand. "I think you know who I am," the voice replied. "I've been following your progress for a long time, and I have to admit I'm impressed by how far you've come." The words made Jeff feel cold. He stood up, pacing in his study, unable to shake the chill that crept through his body. "What do you want?" Jeff demanded, his voice sharper now. "I want to make you an offer," the voice said, still unnervingly calm. "You're in deep, Jeff, deeper than you realize, but I can help you. I can get you out of this mess." Jeff's mind raced. The pieces were beginning to come together. "How do you know about all of this?" he had asked, his voice betraying his disbelief. "And why would you help me?" "Because, Jeff, you and I are not so different," the voice said, almost conversationally. "We both know what it's like to be at the top, but staying there requires certain alliances, and right now, you're in no position to make enemies. The world doesn't work the way you think it does." Jeff's blood ran cold as the voice continued, growing more sinister. "You've been given a chance to walk away from this, Jeff. A chance to keep your name out of the papers, to avoid being dragged through the mud. But you have to make a choice. You're either with us or against us." The words hung in the air like a dark warning. Jeff felt his hand tighten around the phone, his knuckles white with tension. "Who the hell are you?" he finally asked, his voice low but filled with a controlled anger. There was a pause, and then the voice spoke again, more quietly this time, as though savoring the moment. "Let's just say I'm someone who knows how to make things disappear, including people, so choose wisely." Before Jeff could respond, the line went dead. He stood there for a long moment, his mind racing. The man on the other end of the phone had just threatened him, and for the first time in his life, Jeff felt like he was truly in danger, real danger. The kind that didn't care about wealth or power, the kind that didn't hesitate to take what it wanted. He immediately dialed Sarah's number. His hands were shaking, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Sarah, we need to talk," Jeff said as soon as she answered. "I think we've just crossed into something much darker than we realized." "Tell me what happened," Sarah replied, her voice tight with concern. "I just got a call from someone," Jeff said, pacing back and forth. "Someone who knows what's going on, knows about the shell company, the gang, everything. He says he can help, but I don't trust him. He's threatening me." Sarah's voice was tense now. "What did he say? What did he want?" Jeff's mind raced as he recalled the conversation. He said we could walk away from all of this, but we'd have to join him. And if we didn't, well, he didn't finish the sentence, but it was pretty clear what he meant. "You think he's connected to the people we're after?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "I don't know," Jeff said, his mind spinning. "But I think this is bigger than we thought, much bigger." Sarah was silent for a moment, processing the information. "We need to get back to the police. Tell Detective Adams. They might be able to trace the call, figure out who this person is." Jeff shook his head. "I don't know. I think this person is too connected. I think we're dealing with someone who has control over everything. The police might be in over their heads." "Then, what do we do?" Sarah asked, the urgency in her voice rising. Jeff exhaled slowly, his thoughts racing. This wasn't just about exposing a criminal network anymore. This was about survival. Whoever this man was, he was offering Jeff a way out, a way to protect himself and everything he had built. But at what cost? "I don't know," Jeff said finally, "but I think we need to figure out who's pulling the strings. Because if we don't, they'll pull us under." The next morning, Jeff met with Detective Adams and Officer Daniels, feeling more unsettled than ever. He didn't share the details of the phone call with them. Part of him knew that revealing this new threat could jeopardize everything, and part of him wasn't sure if they were already too deep in to turn back. "We're making progress," Detective Adams said, as he and Daniels spread out new evidence across the table. "We traced some of the money flows and found another name that keeps coming up in connection to the shell company. A name you might recognize, Jackson Reed." The name hit Jeff like a blow to the gut. Jackson Reed was a notorious figure in the underground world of business and crime. He was the last person Jeff would ever want involved in his life. "Reed?" Jeff repeated, his voice strained. "What does he have to do with any of this?" "We're not sure yet," Daniels replied. "But his name keeps coming up, and he's tied to multiple illegal operations in Seattle, from money laundering to human trafficking. We think he's the one who's been using your name." Jeff felt a sick feeling settle in his stomach. Jackson Reed. It all clicked into place. The man on the phone, the threat, the power, the control. It was Reed's influence pulling the strings all along. And now, Jeff was trapped in a game where the rules were still being written. The discovery of Jackson Reed's involvement hit Jeff harder than he expected. For years, Reed had been an elusive figure in Seattle's underground world. His name whispered in hushed conversations, linked to everything from shady real estate deals to organized crime syndicates. No one dared to confront him directly, and now Jeff had become an unwilling player in Reed's dark game. The weight of that realization was suffocating. "Jackson Reed," Jeff repeated, as if saying the name out loud could somehow make sense of the chaos swirling around him. "I should have known." Sarah, who had been silent during the meeting, looked at him with wide eyes. "Who is he, Jeff? Why does his name send a chill down your spine?" Jeff leaned back in his chair, his mind struggling to process the flood of thoughts and emotions. "Reed is bad news. He's a fixer. A man who makes problems disappear, if the price is right. But he doesn't just deal in money. He's connected to dangerous people. People who will do anything to protect their interests." Officer Daniels, who had been listening closely, interjected. "So this guy is more than just a businessman." "Way more," Jeff said, his voice tight. "He's a puppet master, and I think he's been using my name to do his dirty work. If he's the one behind the shell company, he could be laundering money, trafficking goods, God knows what else. And I have no idea how deep this goes." Detective Adams, who had been silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke up. "We've been trying to figure out how Reed is involved in this, but his operation is too well hidden. He covers his tracks better than anyone else. But we've got a few leads now. If we can tie him directly to these transactions, it'll give us the leverage we need to bring him down." Jeff looked up at the detective, frustration boiling over. "That's the problem. He's not just a businessman. He's got connections everywhere. I don't know if we can go after him directly. He's too powerful." Officer Daniels nodded in agreement. "He's got influence in every level of society. Police, government, even legitimate businesses. The deeper we dig, the more dangerous it becomes." The reality of their situation was sinking in. No matter how much they wanted to find answers, no matter how much Jeff wanted to clear his name, they were up against a force far more dangerous than they had imagined. Reed wasn't just a criminal. He was the embodiment of corruption itself. He had resources, people on the inside, and the power to make anyone disappear. "If we confront Reed directly, we might as well sign our own death warrants," Jeff said bitterly. "We need another way. We need to get to the root of this without making ourselves targets." Sarah, who had been quietly absorbing the conversation, suddenly stood up, a determined look on her face. "What if we went after his assets? If we can find where he's been hiding his money, maybe we can cripple him without confronting him directly." Jeff raised an eyebrow. "You think he keeps all his assets in one place? He's far too smart for that." "No," Sarah admitted, "but there are always traces. People like him make mistakes. They get too comfortable. They think they're untouchable, and that's when they slip up." Detective Adams and Officer Daniels exchanged a look. "She's not wrong," Adams said. People like Reed don't think they'll ever be caught. They get sloppy. Exactly, Sarah said. We need to track down where he's moving his money, his properties, his dealings. If we can trace the flow of money back to him, maybe we can find a way to take him down from the inside. Hit him where it hurts, in his pocket. Jeff looked at her, impressed. It was a risky move, but it was their best shot. He wasn't sure how Sarah had come up with the idea, but he was grateful for it. This wasn't just about saving his reputation anymore. This was about taking down someone who had already killed once and would kill again without hesitation. I'll get my team on it, Jeff said, standing up. We'll comb through everything. My business records, all the accounts I have access to. We'll find the money. Adams nodded. We'll do the same from our side, but we'll need to stay in touch. You can't go after Reed alone. You'll need protection. He's not going to let this go without a fight. Jeff clenched his jaw. He didn't want protection. He didn't want to owe anyone anything, but the reality was he didn't have much of a choice. Jackson Reed had already shown he was willing to go to any lengths to protect himself. Fine, Jeff said curtly, but I'm calling the shots on this. I need to know everything, every lead, every bit of information you have. We'll keep you in the loop, Officer Daniels promised. With the plan in place, Jeff returned to his office, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The idea of going after Reed, of wading deeper into the world of corruption and crime, terrified him. But at the same time, it felt like the only way out. The only way to clear his name and stop the shadow of Jackson Reed from consuming his life. Over the next few days, Jeff and Sarah worked tirelessly, sifting through mountains of financial records, looking for any hint, any trace that would lead them to Jackson Reed. It was a grueling process, but as they dug deeper, they began to uncover unsettling connections. They found evidence of properties purchased under Reed's name, hidden behind a complex web of shell companies. They tracked several large wire transfers that seemed to flow through multiple accounts, often bouncing from one to the other, obscuring the true destination. It was clear that Reed had been laundering money on an industrial scale. But then, something strange happened. As they followed the money trail, they stumbled upon a pattern that was too neat, too deliberate. Someone had been cleaning up after Reed, making sure that no evidence was left behind. It was as if someone had been anticipating their every move. Jeff's heart raced as he pieced it together. Could it be? They had found a second set of accounts that were linked to Reed but didn't make any sense. They were linked to a series of mysterious figures, all of whom had connections to high-level government officials, police officers, and other influential people. People who had no business being involved in Reed's illegal dealings. But then the most shocking discovery of all. One of the accounts, a large offshore account, was tied to a name Jeff never expected to see. Sarah, look at this, Jeff said, his voice trembling as he pointed to the screen. That account. It's connected to someone from my past, someone I trusted. Sarah leaned in closer, her face pale. Who? Who is it? Jeff swallowed hard, his mind racing. It's someone from inside my own company. The revelation hit Jeff like a thunderclap. Someone in his own business, someone he had trusted with everything, had been working with Reed all along. And just like that, Jeff realized that the conspiracy ran much deeper than he ever could have imagined. It wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about surviving a war that had been waged against him from the inside. They weren't just up against Jackson Reed. They were up against someone much closer than they realized. And now, with the walls closing in, Jeff had no idea who he could trust. Who was the real enemy? The moment the realization hit Jeff, the world seemed to come to a sudden halt. His hand shook as he scrolled through the account details on the screen, his eyes locked on the name that was now haunting him. Someone from inside my own company. The words echoed in his mind, relentless and chilling. He couldn't believe it. He had built his company on trust, on collaboration, and now, someone close to him had betrayed everything he stood for. But who? Who could it be? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. She had seen the shock on Jeff's face when he made the connection, and now she was waiting for him to explain, to make sense of it. But Jeff couldn't. The name on the screen was enough to unnerve him, but not enough to draw any clear conclusions. He needed more time. Someone I thought I could trust, Jeff said finally, his voice thick with disbelief. I can't believe this. Sarah glanced at the name on the screen. Who is it, Jeff? He took a deep breath, running his fingers through his hair, trying to shake the fog of confusion. It's Ethan Mitchell. He's the head of security. He's been with me from the very beginning. He's one of the few people I've always thought had my back. A cold silence settled over them. Ethan Mitchell. A man who had always been there, protecting Jeff's assets, securing his homes, his office buildings, and even his personal life. To think that someone who had been in his inner circle for years could now be working with Jackson Reed, helping to orchestrate his downfall, was a betrayal Jeff couldn't wrap his mind around. Sarah stared at him, wide-eyed. "No way. You think Ethan is involved in all this?" "I don't know," Jeff admitted, "but the account is tied to him. His name is listed as the primary beneficiary of a shell company that was used to funnel money between Reed's operations and my business." Sarah leaned back, her mind spinning. This is huge, Jeff. If Ethan's working with Reed, we're not just looking at a money laundering scheme anymore. We're looking at something much bigger." Jeff ran a hand over his face, his frustration mounting. "I don't understand it. He's supposed to be one of the good guys. He helped me navigate so much of the early days of the company. He was loyal. He was loyal." The words hung in the air, bitter and unreal. Jeff had trusted Ethan with some of his most sensitive secrets, assuming that he was a part of the foundation that kept everything secure. Now it all felt like a cruel joke. "We need to talk to him," Sarah said after a long pause, breaking the silence. "We can't just sit here and assume. We have to confront him directly. Find out what he knows." Jeff shook his head. "I don't think that's a good idea. If Ethan's involved, he's dangerous. He has access to everything. My accounts, my personal information, the private files we've been working with. If we go in too fast, we'll be walking into a trap." Sarah's face was filled with concern, but her voice was steady. "Then what do we do? If we can't confront him directly, we need to get more information. We need to watch him, see what he does." Jeff hesitated. Watching Ethan Mitchell, someone he had worked so closely with, felt like the worst kind of betrayal. But Sarah was right. They couldn't afford to make any rash moves. "All right," Jeff finally agreed, his voice tight. "We'll keep tabs on him. But we need to do it carefully. We can't tip him off. If he's working with Reed, he'll know we're onto him in an instant." The next few days felt like a game of cat and mouse. Jeff's team, along with Detective Adams and Officer Daniels, set up surveillance on Ethan's activities. They tracked his movements, his phone calls, even the emails he was sending and receiving. But everything they found was ordinary, too ordinary. Ethan went about his usual business, doing his job without drawing attention to himself. It was almost as if he knew they were watching, or worse, as if he was waiting for them to make a move. Late one evening, Jeff sat in his office, reviewing more documents, when his phone buzzed with an alert. A message from Sarah popped up. "We found something. Ethan's meeting someone tonight. It's happening soon." His heart skipped a beat. A meeting? He quickly texted back, asking for details, his mind already racing. A few minutes later, Sarah sent him the location, a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. It was quiet, out of the way, the kind of place people went to meet discreetly. Jeff's stomach churned. This could be the break they needed, or it could be the moment when everything fell apart. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jeff and Sarah drove through the city, their minds focused on the meeting. They parked a few blocks away from the cafe, keeping their distance, knowing that getting too close could blow their cover. They sat in the car, their eyes trained on the small cafe as it grew darker, the faint light from the street lamps casting long shadows across the street. "Do you think this is it?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice tense with anticipation. "I don't know," Jeff replied, his jaw clenched. "But if Ethan's meeting someone tonight, it means he's up to something. And we need to know what that something is." They watched for what felt like hours. The cafe was quiet, almost empty. A couple of people came and went, but nothing unusual. Then, just as they were about to give up and leave, a car pulled up. A sleek black sedan. Ethan Mitchell stepped out of the car, wearing his usual suit, looking every bit the professional he always had been. But there was something different about the way he moved tonight. It was subtle, but Jeff noticed it immediately. There was a tension in his shoulders, a coldness in his demeanor that wasn't there before. Ethan glanced around before entering the cafe, his eyes scanning the street as if looking for someone, or making sure no one was watching. "Now's our chance," Jeff muttered under his breath, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. They waited a few more minutes, allowing Ethan enough time to get settled inside. Then they followed, staying far enough behind to avoid being noticed. As they reached the entrance of the cafe, they paused, their eyes through the window trained on Ethan. He was sitting at a table with another man, someone Jeff had never seen before. The man was tall, well-dressed, and his face was hard to read. But what struck Jeff most was the way Ethan interacted with him. There was a sense of respect in the way they spoke, but also a dangerous undertone, something Jeff couldn't quite put his finger on. They couldn't hear what was being said, but they could see the exchange of documents between the two men. Ethan handed over a small envelope, and the man took it without hesitation, tucking it into his jacket pocket. Then, as quickly as the meeting had begun, it ended. The man stood up and left without a word, his face impassive. Ethan watched him go, his expression cold. "What was that about?" Sarah whispered, her breath catching in her throat. "I don't know," Jeff said, feeling the knot in his stomach tighten. "But I have a bad feeling about this." Before he could say anything else, a thought hit him like a bolt of lightning. The man who had just left, he recognized him. It was the same person who had been in the background of the photos Jeff had seen earlier, linked to Jackson Reed's operations. This was no ordinary meeting. "This isn't just about Ethan," Jeff said, his voice low. "This is bigger. We need to find out who that guy is, and we need to do it fast." But as they turned to leave the cafe, Jeff caught sight of something out of the corner of his eye. A shadow, someone watching them from across the street. His heart skipped a beat. "Get in the car," Jeff hissed, suddenly feeling the weight of their situation pressing in on them. But as they moved quickly toward the car, it was already too late. The shadow had moved. And now they were being followed. As Jeff and Sarah raced to the car, the reality of their situation sank in. They weren't just after a criminal network anymore. They were tangled in something much larger, something that now had its eyes fixed firmly on them. And the walls were closing in faster than they could escape. The feeling of being watched never left Jeff as he sped through the streets of Seattle. His hands were gripped tightly on the wheel, knuckles pale under the pressure. Sarah sat beside him, her eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The sense of being followed, tracked by an unknown enemy, hung in the air like a thick fog. Jeff had always been in control of every situation he found himself in, but tonight, for the first time in a long while, he felt completely out of his depth. "Do you think they saw us?" Sarah asked, her voice edged with panic. "I don't know," Jeff muttered, his focus shifting between the road and the mirror. "I think they know we're onto something, though. They're not going to let us just walk away." "That man in the cafe, I recognized him," Sarah said, still shaken. "He was one of the figures linked to Reed's network, wasn't he?" Jeff nodded grimly. "Yes, and that thought sent a chill up his spine. They were up against someone who knew how to play the long game." As they reached the edge of the industrial area, the streetlights began to disappear entirely. Jeff's eyes darted from one intersection to the next, trying to figure out the best escape route. But then, before he could react, something else caught his attention. A second car. It came from a side street, its headlights flaring as it pulled in front of Jeff's car, blocking their escape route. The vehicle was large, black, and menacing, like something out of a mobster movie. For a split second, Jeff considered turning around, but the black sedan behind them was now too close, cutting off the option. Sarah gasped. "We're trapped." Jeff's heart raced as he slammed on the brakes, coming to a halt just in time to avoid colliding with the vehicle that had blocked their path. His mind worked in overdrive. They were surrounded now. There was no way out. But there was still one card left to play. "Stay calm," Jeff said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever happens, don't get out of the car." The black sedan came to a slow stop behind them. Then the door of the car in front of them opened. A tall man, dressed in black, stepped out, his face shadowed by the night. He was tall, imposing, and his movements were deliberate, like someone who had been in control of situations just like this before. The man didn't make any immediate move toward Jeff or Sarah. Instead, he simply leaned against the hood of the car in front of them, watching, waiting. The seconds stretched into eternity as Jeff and Sarah sat motionless, watching the man from the rearview mirror. Finally, the silence was broken. "Jeff Bezos," the man said, his voice deep and cold. "You've been making a lot of noise lately." Jeff's blood ran cold. He couldn't see the man's face clearly, but he recognized the voice. It was the same man who had met with Ethan in the cafe, and now, here he was, blocking Jeff's way in the middle of the night. The same man who had ties to Jackson Reed. "I don't want any trouble," Jeff said, keeping his voice as calm as he could manage. "Just let us go. Whatever your problem is, we can sort it out." The man chuckled softly. "Oh, it's not about sorting anything out, Jeff. You've been digging too deep. You think you can take down Jackson Reed and his entire operation just by poking around in some records. It doesn't work that way." Jeff's mind was spinning. He needed a way out. He couldn't just sit here like a sitting duck. The man's words confirmed what Jeff had feared. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous this situation was becoming. And now, they had made it personal. "You've been a problem," the man continued. a problem that needs to be addressed. Before Jeff could respond, there was a sharp click, and suddenly the black sedan door opened. Another figure stepped out, walking toward the car. Jeff's heart raced again as the new figure approached the man who was speaking. The second man was different, smaller, more slender, but no less menacing. He wore a suit, but his eyes gleamed with cold calculation, and there was something about the way he walked that screamed authority. "Mr. Bezos," the new man said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I hope you don't mind us paying you a visit. We have business to discuss." Sarah looked at Jeff, her face pale with fear. "What do we do?" she whispered. Jeff's mind raced. They were outnumbered, trapped, and completely at the mercy of these men. Every instinct pulled him to get out of there, to make a run for it. But he couldn't risk Sarah's safety, and he couldn't risk throwing away everything they had uncovered so far. Before he could form a plan, the first man spoke again, this time with more authority. "You got one chance to walk away, Bezos," he said. "Get in the car. Come with us. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Jeff looked at Sarah, then back at the two men. He could see the cold threat in their eyes, and he knew that making a wrong move now could cost them everything. But his mind was already working through every possibility, every avenue of escape. As the seconds ticked by, it felt like time itself had frozen. Then, without warning, a flash of headlights appeared in the distance. Jeff's heart skipped a beat. It was another car. And this time, it wasn't a threat. It was their last chance. The headlights of the approaching car cut through the dark night like a beacon of hope. Jeff's heart raced as the vehicle sped down the road, its silhouette growing larger with each passing second. Was it a friend, or had someone else joined the enemy's ranks? The two men blocking their car didn't seem to notice the new arrival yet. The one who had been speaking, the larger, imposing figure, was still standing in front of Jeff's car, his arms folded. The smaller, more refined man had moved closer to the driver's side, his eyes never leaving Jeff's face. But then, just as the car came into view, the larger man's gaze flickered. He looked over his shoulder at the approaching headlights, and for a brief moment, confusion flashed across his face. That's when Jeff acted. "Now!" Jeff hissed under his breath to Sarah. Without hesitation, Jeff slammed his foot on the accelerator, sending the car lurching forward. The engine roared as they shot past the man in front of them, who barely had time to react. The smaller man tried to move to block the path, but he wasn't fast enough. They tore past him, narrowly avoiding a collision. The black sedan that had been tailing them was now too close, but they were gaining distance, fast. Behind them, the figure in the oncoming car swerved onto the road, forcing the black sedan to halt abruptly. The vehicle in front of them had come to their rescue. For a brief moment, Jeff couldn't make out who was behind the wheel, but the sound of the engine and the way it handled the road told him it wasn't someone who was afraid of a confrontation. The black sedan seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to follow them or deal with the newcomer. In that moment, Jeff felt a fleeting sense of relief. He floored the accelerator again, pushing the car as fast as it could go, but now the danger was far from over. "Who are they?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling as they sped down the deserted road. "I don't know," Jeff muttered, his focus split between the road and the rearview mirror. "But we need to get somewhere safe. We can't outrun them forever." As they neared the edge of the city, the unfamiliar car began to fall back, the black sedan still hot on their heels. Jeff's instincts screamed at him to find a way to get off the main roads, to lose them in the maze of streets and alleyways that only a few people knew. But then, just as they approached a narrow street, lined with tall buildings and quiet warehouses, the black sedan pulled away. The driver had made the decision to break off the chase, but it wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Jeff drove on for another 10 minutes before pulling into an alley that led to an underground parking garage. He parked the car in a dark corner, hidden from view. The engine went silent, and for a moment, they both just sat there, breathing heavily, processing what had just happened. "That was too close," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "Yeah, but we're not out of the woods yet." Jeff's voice was sharp. "We need to figure out who those people were, why they were following us, and most importantly, how they knew where we were going." They sat in silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. The adrenaline rush from the chase began to fade, but the gnawing question of who was behind the attack lingered. "Jeff, we can't just sit here. We have to do something," Sarah said after a long pause. "I know," Jeff replied, rubbing his temples, "but I'm not sure what. We can't just call the police. There's too much at stake. If this thing goes public, if the wrong people find out we're involved in all of this, it could ruin everything. My company, my reputation." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes determined. But you can't back down now. We've come too far. We know too much about Reed's operation, and we know someone inside your company is working with him. Jeff stared at her, his mind racing. But who? Ethan is the obvious choice, but why would he be doing this? And what about those men? The one in the cafe, the one who spoke to me tonight. He wasn't just a lackey. He's someone important, someone connected to Reed. I think we need to get back to basics, Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. We need to re-examine everything. We've been working off assumptions, but we don't really know who's pulling the strings here. It could be someone else entirely. Jeff nodded, though he still felt uneasy. You're right. We need to find out who's really behind this and what they want. Just as he was about to start the car again, a loud bang echoed in the garage. The sound was sharp, like metal hitting metal. Both of them froze, instinctively ducking down in their seats. What was that? Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. Jeff's heart raced again. No way. Could they have followed them? A second bang rang out, louder this time, followed by the sound of footsteps. Someone was approaching the car, and they were getting closer. Jeff's mind raced. They couldn't be caught here. This was too dangerous. Get down, he ordered, his voice low. Sarah crouched in her seat, trying to stay out of view. Jeff turned off the engine, the car now bathed in complete silence, except for the sound of footsteps that were growing nearer. For a long minute, neither of them dared to move. Then the shadow of a figure appeared in the dim light of the garage. The figure approached the car, but there was no movement beyond the footsteps. Jeff's eyes darted between Sarah and the exit of the garage. His options were running out. He wasn't sure who was out there, but he was starting to feel the walls close in again. Whoever it was, they didn't seem to be in a hurry. That fact alone terrified Jeff. The figure stopped right in front of the car. Jeff could feel his pulse quicken, a pit growing in his stomach. But just as he was about to prepare for the worst, he heard something unexpected. A voice. Jeff Bezos? It wasn't a threat. It was calm. Curious, even. Jeff's eyes narrowed. He slowly lowered the seat to peep through the side window, just enough to see who was standing there. A man in his late 40s stood outside the car, dressed in a nondescript suit. His face was familiar. Jeff had seen him once or twice at business conferences, but he hadn't paid much attention to him. But it was his presence in this moment that sent a shiver down Jeff's spine. Do I know you? Jeff asked cautiously, keeping his voice steady. The man smiled, a wry twist to his lips. We've never formally met, but you and I have a lot in common, Mr. Bezos. Jeff froze. This is not a coincidence. The man's smile deepened. I think you've been looking for answers in all the wrong places. Just then, the garage lights flickered, and for the briefest moment, Jeff saw something in the man's eyes, a glint of something far more dangerous than anything he had encountered so far. And I'm here to give you one, the man continued, his voice low. Jeff's heart pounded. It was all connected. The real game was only just beginning. The man outside the car stood still, his presence unsettling. Jeff and Sarah exchanged a quick glance, both of them instinctively bracing for whatever might come next. The tension in the air felt thick, like a storm about to break. I think you've been looking for answers in all the wrong places, the man repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. But I'm here to give you one. Jeff's mind raced. Who was this man? His calm demeanor felt out of place in the middle of all the chaos they had been through. This wasn't just some thug sent by Jackson Reed or his network. There was something more to him, something far deeper. Jeff could feel it in his gut. You don't know who I am, do you? The man asked, his tone still disturbingly calm. You've been chasing shadows, trying to uncover a conspiracy that's already in motion. You're too late. Jeff's pulse quickened. He didn't like where this was going. He could feel Sarah's breath beside him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. I don't know what you're talking about, Jeff said, keeping his voice steady, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The man took a step closer to the car, his face coming into full view. He was older than Jeff had initially thought, mid-40s, maybe older, with gray at his temples and deep lines around his eyes. His suit was neat, though his shirt collar looked slightly worn. The kind of man who didn't need to show power. He had it in the way he carried himself. You don't have to know who I am, but I can help you, if you're willing to listen. The man's eyes softened just for a moment, a flicker of something human behind them. This mess you're in, Mr. Bezos, is much bigger than anything you've uncovered so far. You're not dealing with petty criminals anymore. You're playing with people who move entire nations. Jeff couldn't help but feel the weight of his words. He didn't know whether to be scared or intrigued. The last few days had been a whirlwind of unexpected turns, betrayals, and secrets. But now, this man was talking as if he held the keys to everything Jeff had been fighting against. "Who are you?" Jeff finally asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "And why should I trust you?" The man smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was calculating, almost as though he was enjoying the situation. "I don't need your trust, but you need mine. I'm part of the same system you've been trying to take down. Only I've been on the inside for much longer. Let's just say I'm an old friend of Jackson Reed, and what you're seeing is only the tip of the iceberg." Jeff's mind spun. An old friend of Reed? Everything was starting to piece together in an eerie way. Jackson Reed wasn't just some criminal mastermind. He was part of something far more intricate, something Jeff hadn't even begun to understand. "Why come to me now?" Jeff asked. "If you've been part of this for so long, why help me?" The man sighed, taking a step back. He looked up at the dark sky above them before meeting Jeff's gaze again. "Because," he said quietly, "I've seen enough. I've watched this system consume everything it touches, and I can't be a part of it anymore. There are people above Jackson Reed, people far more dangerous, people who control things at a level you can't even begin to fathom. The kind of people who don't care about you or me or anyone. And Jackson, he's just their pawn, a puppet. He thinks he's in charge, but he's not. I came to warn you. You need to stop him before it's too late." Jeff felt the blood drain from his face. The weight of the man's words hit him like a freight train. He had spent days thinking he was up against Jackson Reed and his network of criminals, but now he was hearing something far more sinister. People above Reed. The realization hit Jeff like a punch to the gut. The stakes were higher than he could have imagined. This wasn't just about exposing Reed anymore. It was about stopping a force so powerful that it could reshape everything. "And how do I stop them?" Jeff asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man's smile deepened, though it was still tinged with something dark. "You don't," he said softly, "not by yourself, but together we can. I have the connections. I know where they operate, who they are. The question is, Mr. Bezos, do you really want to go down that road?" The man's question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Jeff looked at Sarah, whose expression mirrored his own, confusion, fear, but also curiosity. This was a decision unlike anything he had ever faced. The choice wasn't just about whether to fight Reed anymore. It was about whether to confront a shadowy global system, a force that operated behind the scenes, pulling strings Jeff had never even known existed. For a long moment, neither Jeff nor Sarah spoke. Then, slowly Jeff exhaled, his decision solidifying in his mind. This was the moment where everything changed. There would be no turning back. "All right," Jeff said, his voice steady, "tell me everything." The man nodded once, his eyes glinting with something like approval. "You're in for a wild ride, Mr. Bezos," he said, turning to walk away. "But if you want to bring down Reed and everything he represents, you'll need more than money. You'll need a team. People who know how to play the game." And with that, the man disappeared into the shadows, leaving Jeff and Sarah alone in the dark, their future uncertain, but their resolves stronger than ever. In the days that followed, Jeff was forced to make choices he never thought he would face. He knew that whatever lay ahead would require every ounce of his energy, every connection he had, and a level of risk that he couldn't yet comprehend. But for the first time in his life, Jeff Bezos felt like he was no longer just reacting to circumstances. He was actively shaping the future. Jackson Reed was only the beginning. There were bigger players in the game, and Jeff was now at the center of it all. He knew that taking on these forces would require more than just money and power. It would require a new kind of courage, one that would test not only his business acumen but his very principles. As the days passed, the wheels of this new battle began to turn, and Jeff found himself no longer a victim of circumstances, but a man on a mission. He couldn't undo the past, but he could change the future. And with that, Jeff Bezos took the first step into a world that was far more dangerous, far more complex, than he had ever imagined. A world that would force him to question everything he had ever known about loyalty, power, and what it meant to fight for what was right. The story of his battle against Jackson Reed had only just begun.